Welcome to our Tiger Day live stream. In just a moment we're going to be running out Tiger 131, so we won't be doing any commentary when that goes around, just so you can listen to the engine note of that Maybach engine roaring away. But later on we'll be giving commentary on some other vehicles we're going to bring out to complement the Tiger, so sit back and enjoy this wonderful Tiger Day live stream of moving armour.
Please remember to like, subscribe or click the little notification bell if you don't want to miss out on these videos. And I'd just like to say thank you to all our patrons for making this possible. Please join them if you can.
So, ladies and gentlemen, Tiger 131, you can all go home now, you've seen that run. If you want to stay, we're going to bring some other tanks out for you. So, just a bit of a contrast between how German tank design advanced so quickly in the wartime period. This is an L model, so the Germans use the phrase Ausführung, or iteration, or mark as it would be called for us. This is L, they go through the letters. Now this particular model, Panzer III, is quite late in the production run. It's got a 5cm gun on it, so 50mm long-barreled anti-tank gun on it. It's got extra armour bolted on the front. Now for the Germans, they in the 1930s, when Hitler comes to power in 1933, he basically rips up the Versailles Peace Treaty. The Germans have already secretly been working with the Soviet Union, the Russians. They've been sending their engineers, they've been sending some vehicles, they've been developing out to Kazan in Russia. They've been experimenting because by the end of the First World War, Germany had only made 20 of its own tanks. So they're not really a tank building nation. They've got to learn the art. So Panzer I and Panzer IIs, in many ways, are tanks that they learn how to train with. They are armour plated, they can be used in combat, but they're learning their way with Panzer I and Panzer II. Panzer III, which is this fella, Panzer IV, are what they think they want to go to war with. And their doctrine, this awful word that we all run away from, but it's really important to understand, what do they think the tank's there for? Their doctrine is that the tank is going to support the infantry to make a breakthrough. There's still, all the nations are thinking back to World War I, static front lines, how do we break through that front line? And the Panzer IV is therefore going to have a short-barreled 7.5cm howitzer on it. That's so it can fire shells that explode, will blow up pillboxes, machine gun nests, maybe take out anti-tank guns. Then these tanks will be able to go through the gap, almost like a cruiser tank as we sometimes know it, to then go and cause mayhem behind the lines, and they've got an anti-tank gun on them should they bump into an enemy tank. But the idea of tank-on-tank engagements in the 1930s, it's tended to be avoided as a topic almost, because there's not that many tanks out there, so the chances of you bumping into one, let's not worry about that one too much. But if we do, we've got a suitable gun. Originally it was going to be that 37mm gun on the early Panzer IIIs. So they build what seems to be very sensible, very reliable, very good German engineering with these Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs, but the German military are basically saying to Hitler, we're not going to be ready for a major war till about 1942, 1943. Now we all know going to war is not something that anyone can actually plan exactly to a date. That tends to go wrong very easily. So the Germans in 1940, they're using their Panzer I and Panzer II. They've luckily collected a whole load of Czechoslovakian tanks, and they're only just starting to put into serious production the Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs. Now this particular vehicle, it's captured in North Africa. We think at the Battle of Alam Halfa, Montgomery's just taken charge of the 8th Army. He's trying to get his famous phrase, a grip on things. The Germans under Rommel do a last-ditch attack at the British positions before the Battle of Alamein, and then it turns around the other way. The British then do their attack afterwards. So we've got photographs of this particular Panzer L. There it is, being de-bombed, as it were, before it's sent back to the UK for analysis. And most of the German tanks we have here at the Tank Museum are ones that were captured during the war, returned to Britain, so we could work out what's the best way of trying to defeat them. Now this Panzer III's got some original battle damage still on it. We're not too sure exactly where it was captured, but we do know the unit, and it's been one of those vehicles that's always been a bit of a runner here for most of its history at the museum. You'll see photographs of this running around in a grey colour back from the 1960s. So there it is as a complement, two vehicles, Tiger I and the Panzer III, two running bits of German armour, but also a really good contrast between how far that Tiger, look at the difference in scale there, look at the way that's suddenly jumped what seems to be like a generation
coming out with a vehicle that is just so much bigger. Now, if you're out in the arena a bit earlier on, you would have seen this vehicle. Stuart was talking about it. Again, trying to put vehicles in context. This is what Japan did for a tank back in the early 1930s. Goes into production in mid-30s, actually keep making them pretty much to the end of the war. This is the Type 95, or the Ha-Go, the third model, basically, of tank they built. Now this is, again, this Japanese tank designer, Tommy O'Hara. It sounds like an Irish comedian, Tommy O'Hara. He comes up with the idea of bell crank suspension system, which if you look on the side there, you'll see a wheel goes up, pushes a cylinder back down, and that's in essence is a long cylinder-like spring. The gun, 37mm gun there, is not that powerful, but with two machine guns, in the one at the back of the turret, one in the front there, you're looking at a vehicle, when this is designed, it's about equivalent to the American M3 tank, the Stuart light tank that goes into service early in 1941. The equivalent from America. America, by 1939, in its entire history, has only made about 380 vehicles. I mean, tanks, that is. It's made an awful lot of trucks, vehicles, in the way of cars, etc., of course. But what it is doing in the 20s and 30s, American military budgets, people like MacArthur, they hang on to people. They don't spend money on equipment. They just do experimentation. So when war comes, they are ready to then throw money at the problem, and they've got prototype systems such as the suspension, such as using the radial aeroplane engine in the back of this vehicle and that 37mm gun. So they put these together in a hurry. It's the British that first used these tanks later in 1941, and because of their American reliability, the fact they work very well, they're easy to maintain relative to most British tanks at this time. A British soldier calls it a real honey, and that name stuck. We call it officially, Churchill likes the idea, instead of all these abbreviations all the time that we forget which one's which, M3A, whatever it is, Churchill says, give me names. So they call American vehicles after American generals. So this one is after General Stuart, Civil War general, but for the troops, on the whole, if you read a lot of the accounts, honey goes down really well. It's a honey, because they love it. Small turret, you can see, two-man turret. Again, in the front of the vehicle, you've got a driver and co-driver. The big radial engine in the back, that's part of the problem for the Americans. We'll see that with the Sherman. The aircraft industry wants them. They're big, round and tall, so the drive shaft goes right through the middle of the vehicle, quite high. Gearbox and drive is at the front. But at the same time, if you can make that vehicle work, it's great for the British. Now you can see it's a relative nippy tank, and that is again back to speed can be part of your defensive mechanisms. Get out of trouble quick, keep moving, keep weaving, don't let the enemy lay their guns on you, because your armour protection on this is pretty minimal, which is worth bearing in mind, so you don't want to be hanging around too long on this one. Now they also made a version of this tank with a diesel engine in. Engines, as we'll see with the next tanks coming on, is part of the American issue. They are, as we said, they experimented in the 30s. They know Congress, the whole idea, it sounds like we're just taking the mick out of the Americans when we say they throw money at the problem. That's their war plan. They knew they had a very small cadre army that should war come, we will expand rapidly, and that's when we will spend money on equipment. They start with the M3 Grant tank. British designers helping with that vehicle. We started off by going to America before they're in the war saying, can you build tanks for us? And that leads on to the fact that afterwards we end up saying, no, we'll buy into the tanks you're going to make because that makes it simpler. Now after the Grant tank, we then move on very quickly. The Grant basically is an interim vehicle. It has got a howitzer in the hull. The Americans haven't quite got to the point of being able to put a fully 360 turret into production yet that will take a sizable gun, such as a 75mm. Now, as you'll be aware, this particular Sherman, if you look at every Sherman, there's lots of differences. This particular type of Sherman, it's got the later war wider track on it. This one has got a twin diesel engine in the back, because back to, they couldn't make one type of engine in enough quantities, so they basically say to the manufacturers, you come up with what will suit your vehicle that you're making. So this is a twin General Motors diesel engine in the back there, and this one as well has got the later war longer 76mm gun on it. Now 75mm, only a millimetre different, but when we see the 75mm gun Sherman come on in a moment, you'll notice the fact that it's a shorter barreled gun, and it's what they call medium velocity. This is a higher velocity gun with the aim that it can send the rounds out with much more force behind them. Now this particular tank, this model with the twin diesels, tended to be given to the Russians. It was given to Britain as well. It wasn't used by the American forces in the field, even though, as you can see, this is the tank that was used in the Fury movie. Little bit of license there, but we've kept all the bits and pieces. It's got that HVSS, a later model suspension on it. And it was the tank that was a hero tank with Brad Pitt in the top and a couple of our guys 6 months on a film set just north of London. And of course it fought against Tiger 131. It was our Tiger in the film as well that went off site for a couple of weeks and was used as the enemy Tiger tank, doing whatever silly things it did in the movie, like manoeuvring from a position that was perfectly safe for a Tiger. What you would not be taught to do as a Tiger commander, you just sit there and wait for the enemy to come to you, pick them off with your superior firepower and your range, keep your thick armour facing towards the enemy. What you don't do is move and expose your thinner rear end or your side armour to the enemy, which is exactly what happens in the film. So here comes our Chaffee, sorry about that, talking all about it, and it hasn't started running around yet, but there it goes. Cadillac build it, so does a company called Massey Harris. Cadillac are the design authorities, but they come up with a new engine in the back that they've also been putting in the late model M5 Stuart tanks, up to about 35 miles an hour, so that's speedy for a vehicle like this. This one's just been restored, so it's in lovely order, and it's painted as a British Chaffee. It's being used at the end of the war, and I've got an account here. Some of you may know there's a book called Troop Leader by Bill Bellamy, and Bellamy was given a Chaffee just at the end of the war, and he says of it in his memoir, he said, I was allocated a Chaffee tank, Hemlock 3, and that's what's on the side of our restored one here, as my command tank, plus a Humber Scout car, Hurstwood. I was of course used to the latter, but the Chaffee was new to me, and I became more and more impressed by its speed and manoeuvrability as the days passed. Because again, you've got that very thin 25mm armour, you've got a good gun on it. They put a 75mm gun. It's a gun that was originally, it's developed from one that of all things was put on a B-25 Mitchell bomber. It was for ground attack. They develop it further. It's got relatively low pressure. In other words, the rounds don't come out with enormous amount of force behind them. But at 75mm, that still makes a fairly big bang. Again, you are not there to take on bigger tanks. It was certainly turned the other way, one assumes, from a Tiger. But again, it gives you an amount of firepower, and for the reconnaissance role that it's designed for, that works very well, because you can lay down supporting fire, you can lay down smoke, lay down some high explosive, but the speed will get you out of trouble. And it's got a very good ride. It's got torsion bar suspension, so those twisted metal bars across the floor of the vehicle, and that will help give you a good ride over rough countryside. Again, that lovely angled turret, and the Chaffee goes on to be used as a bed for a number of other vehicles. An M16 version with anti-aircraft guns. They carried a 155 and a 105 artillery piece as well, and they saw service in many countries after World War II. They get to the war before the end of 1945. They're still fighting in Europe at the end of the war. They don't see a huge amount of action, but they certainly do post-war, Indo-Pakistan war. They're used in the Middle East, even the Far East. You'll see they're being used in Vietnam, Indochina as well. So the next tank we're going to be bringing on in a moment is the British Comet tank. Now the Comet is a cruiser tank. We looked at an infantry tank earlier on, that idea that things to help the infantry advance. A cruiser tank was there really, it was supposed to be speedier to go through the gap. So we ended up with the A-13, we ended up with vehicles such as the Covenanter, used that as a cruiser tank as well. Again, in Britain, we like the idea of, you know, we got better guns. We got the 6-pounder gun as early as 1940. We got the 17-pounder as early as 1941. The problem we had was, of course, production. In Britain, Churchill said, aircraft and the Navy comes first. And in 1940, you can entirely understand that. We needed fighters to defend ourselves, the Navy to protect the Channel. Only if the Germans had crossed the Channel was the Army going to be needed. And so that rule of priority going to the Air Force and the Navy, that continued not just in 1941 but into 1942 as well, which brought our own tank production a bit behind the curve. Luckily for us, those American Shermans and the M3 Stuart tanks start coming over in good numbers, so we end up with those to be able to use in the intermittent period. What happens is we don't decide to put into production any new designs, keep going the ones in the factory, and that's one of the reasons why some of our tanks seem to lag behind in that mid-war period. Now the engine in the back of that vehicle that's making that glorious noise is of course the Rolls-Royce Meteor. It's an engine that was started the war as a Merlin in the Spitfire. It goes on into the Lancaster. Various other planes use it. A guy called Rowbottom, he manages to derate it. He has a team that puts together what they then call the Meteor. It's got about 600 horsepower. That's about double the horsepower that we were putting in our earlier war tanks. And that means you've got some welly behind you. You've got some oomph. That will get you around the battlefield. You are not struggling all the time, and with the Comet there, it's a very good tank. Often compared, again, I'm not sure the Cruise would quite done it this way, in many ways its stats almost compare with the Panther. The firepower is very similar. With discarding Sabo, it's even better. It's got that Meteor engine for power at the back. It's still got the stepped front on the front. Everyone says, why didn't we use sloped armour more? That's because for the Comet tank, they wanted still to put the British Beezer machine gun on it in the front there. And that takes a vertical plate to hold it. The next tank we come out with, we've done away with that hull machine gun. Now, the tank that's coming on now with its turret reverse, the guns in its travel lock there, this is the tank we made right at the end of the war, doesn't see service, the famous Centurion tank, the A41. What happens with the Centurion, it starts off, you can see that front bit now, we don't have a machine gun put on the glacé plate, so they've got rid of that lovely stepped frontage to it. It ends up with a 17-pounder gun when the first ones are made. They are sent out to Germany. They miss the end of the war by a couple of weeks. Operation Sentry, they're trialled in Germany. Everyone realises we're onto a winner here. It's got a good gun, and that gun can be upgraded. So they start with a 17-pounder. They then put on a 20-pounder gun. And that moves on at the end of the 1950s to a 105mm gun. It's got that Meteor engine in the back. Now the one downside of the Meteor is very thirsty, so the range of the tanks, the Centurion tank when they first go into service is not that great. They actually build later models with extra tanks on the rear. Now the Centurion is produced for the British Army. This particular Centurion has just been gifted to us by Switzerland. And in 1950, Switzerland, after World War II, they want to buy tanks. They're changing their defence policies. They have armed neutrality, as it's called. They end up coming to Britain saying, can we buy the Centurion? We're very keen to sell tanks in the early 1950s. We need money. We're a bankrupt nation. What happens, though, is the Korean War kicks off, and we suddenly need all the tanks we can make for our own forces or our allies or Commonwealth countries. So the Swiss have to wait, and it's 5 whole years before we finally get round to selling them Centurion tanks, and they upgrade their ones as well, just as we did in service. So this one has got little differences on it, different smoke discharges, a different radio arrangement, some different stowage, but they did the same pretty much upgrades. They put that 105mm gun on. The whole issue of that gun, it's a great British design. What happened in 1956, the Hungarian uprising, a T-55A tank was driven into the British Embassy compound. The defence attaché measured the armour and the size of the gun, 100mm gun. They measured the armour and realised, hang on a second, we don't think our 20-pounder is going to be able to go through the front of it. So there's a project at Fort Halstead, Royal Armaments, or Royal Ordnance as it was. They end up pushing forward a design for a 105mm gun, and they come out with an absolute world beater. The L7 gun is put on our tanks, the Centurion. We give it to the Germans, they put it on the Leopard tank, we'll see it in a moment. The Americans put it on the first of the Abrams tanks. And it's back to how sometimes, and I hint about the Ukraine, how a vehicle, one moment we think it's out of date, it's behind the curve, it's not going to be used in the way we think it will be. A little bit of technology, suddenly it's at the front of the curve again. So, and I mentioned that, we're going to see a T-72 in a moment, and the usual one. Most of the tanks we're seeing here, the Americans, 1950, we don't want a tank. One man with a Panzerfaust or a bazooka can knock it out. It is going to be American policy, get rid of our tanks, we don't need them. Korean War kicks off. We have to build tanks very quickly again, or the Americans do. So each time we seem to write off the tank, it comes back again. And the tank coming on now is what the Germans built after the Second World War, using that British L7 105mm gun. Now in 1955 the Bundeswehr was reformed, the German army, for the first time. They're first kitted out with American vehicles. We want them, of course, to join NATO, the West Germans. We are worried about the size of the Soviet bloc, the Soviet army. We must get the Germans back in the fight, as it were. So they then start their program for what they are going to call the Standard Panzer. They're originally going to build it with the French. As with so many of these cooperative ventures, they fall out in the end, and the Germans end up with this fellow, the Leopard, what we now know as a Leopard 1. The Germans had forgotten all about, or decided they wanted purposely to go against things like the Tiger, thick, heavy armour. We don't want that. We want mobility instead. So the original Leopard 1s only had protection against about 30mm cannon fire. They put a thumping great big MTU diesel engine in the back, give that vehicle power. So you can see there and hear there that sense of power in that engine gives. That gives them speed on the battlefield. That means that the argument was, if you're as mobile as you can be, that means you're less likely to be hit by the enemy anti-tank gunners or tanks. So that's how the Germans took their tank philosophy forward, and they use a great gun. They've used that British L7 105mm gun. So off they go, and where the Germans have been brilliantly clever, they've kept on developing the Leopard. We're now at the Leopard 2A7. We've gone through adding extra armour protection levels have gone up. They've added bigger guns, we're up to 120mm gun, and that tank is now in service in many countries. It pretty much overtook the countries that took the British Centurion tank. After the Centurions went out of service, most countries took on the Leopard. Now, in that Cold War, that post-World War II period, the Russians carried on building tanks. They got no qualms that the tank was vulnerable. They kept building tanks, T-55s, T-54s. Then they move on to the T-62 and then the T-64. This one, coming on now, is a T-72 tank. Even though we tend to think of the Soviet era as being very a monolithic society, production, etc., actually tank factories were still rivals. The T-64 tank, built in Kharkov, was being promoted in Moscow. A rival company comes along with what they considered a kind of cheaper version of an earlier tank, a T-62 tank. And they said, basically, the Russian authorities called it would be a mobilization tank. If we go to war, we'll start building it. Very cleverly, though, they managed to get it put into production in 1970, and that leads, basically, it's this tank here, the T-72. 125mm gun, low profile because they've got rid of the loader. It's now an auto loader. You didn't need a guy standing up whacking the big rounds in there. A round goes in, followed by a bag charge or a case full of explosives, and that's on a carousel beneath the turret. You can see that the height of this vehicle, it's kept low. It's basically a tac tank. The idea was if the Warsaw Pact countries had attacked NATO, there would be swarms of these tanks in echelon. They are not to be lived on. They are there for the attack. Western NATO countries, we tend to think of our tanks as homes. These ones were going to be used on the day of operation, and there would be so many of them that they'd be following up. Once the first wave has gone through, another wave would take over. So the idea of the T-72, it's that Russian philosophy, keep it simple. It's got a diesel engine in the back, very similar to the one that was in the T-34 in the Second World War. It's a development of that. A good, powerful gun, but plenty of them. And they would be used in a certain sort of manner. The issue that we're seeing now, of course, in the Ukraine is very similar tanks. T-72, B3, slightly upgraded ones. But they're being used not as the original Warsaw Pact envisaged them to be used. They're being used what we can only describe as in a very amateurish way. They're not being part of an all-arms force. They're not being protected by their infantry, and they're quite understandably being picked off. It's also pretty apparent that the crew training is not that brilliant. You know, some of these T-tanks have been captured with sights in that are still in their wrappers because newer sights have come along, but the guys don't know how to use them. And with a conscript army as well, you're seeing that situation where unless you're sophisticated enough to know how to get the best, if you've had that good training, etc., to get the best from the vehicle, which some of those Ukrainians are obviously doing at the moment, they're fighting almost the same type of generation tank against each other. So this T-72, it's being used by the British Army at the moment. We have recognition exercises. We take it up to Salisbury Plain every now and again. This particular one's ex-Polish Army. The T-72, about 25,000 of them were made. Some were made in Poland, some in the Czech Republic. This is a Polish one, and again, they tend to have lots of different build standards. The Russians themselves did not want the top quality tanks. They reserved for their own military. The standard, the thickness of the armour, for example, is slightly different on those that were made in other Warsaw Pact countries. Now, for NATO, our lesson, or certainly Britain's lesson from the Second World War, instead of going light and very mobile, British tank designers, many of them in the 1960s have seen service, of course, in the Second World War. They decided, no, Britain, we wanted to go heavy. We wanted thick armour protection. We wanted a very powerful gun on our tanks to outrange the enemy. And we were less worried about mobility because we were going to be a defending army. We didn't have to race to capture bridges or to get across to the Rhine or Niederrhein. And therefore this tank, the Chieftain, ended up with some of the thickest armour protection of any tank in that post-war period. The Chieftain was fitted with a 120mm smoothbore gun, rifle gun on the Chieftain. It has got something called a muzzle reference system. Before that gun fires, under the cap at the end of the barrel, it's covered now at the moment by a shroud to stop water going down that barrel, but there's a cap there with a mirror underneath it. Before the gun fires, a light is shone to that mirror, bounce back inside the turret, and there's a system that can work out if the turret, or if the gun rather, has got any bend or any droop in it. Bend because cold wind blowing on the side can chill the metal a fraction of a millimetre. It means that your barrel is slightly bent. If you fire at a target 2.5 kilometres away, you're going to miss. So that is computed out before this tank gun fires. And we're now firing at this generation metal darts, about 13 inches long, made of tungsten or depleted uranium. They go through the air, they've got no explosive on at all. They are there to penetrate enemy armour. So Chieftain could engage targets 2.5, even 3 kilometres away. Those metal darts fire at faster than Concorde. As I mentioned, no explosive on them, just the sheer kinetic energy will burrow its way through enemy armour. And quite often as they're doing that, they get very hot. They will therefore cause secondary fires inside the tank they've hit. And a well-trained Chieftain crew, basically, if that gun's onto you, out to about 2.5 kilometres away, you're a goner. First round hits go up enormously with this generation of tank. World War II, even things like the Tiger, 1 round over, 1 round under, 3rd round on the target. Modern tank gunnery has leapt forward. The downsides, many of you here will realise with the Chieftain, with the engine. The Leyland L60 engine in the back had lots of trouble in its service life. Interestingly, R1, I say this carefully, keeps going rather well. They need a lot of careful maintenance to keep them going, the L60 engine, but it was definitely a weak spot. And some of the countries that bought the Chieftain in the Middle East insisted on a new engine in the rear. We've got a version called Khalid that was actually being originally designed for the Shah of Iran. It ended up with the Jordanians, and that's got a different engine than the multi-fuel L60. End of the 1950s, NATO said we want all our engines to be multi-fueled. Most countries completely ignored that. For some reason in Britain, we went along with it and tried to design a big engine that could take petrol, diesel, aviation fuel, bottle of vodka, whatever you had, and it never quite worked. Now this is an American Cold War tank, the M60. Now, after the Second World War, the Americans had jitters about tanks. The 1950s, I mentioned, they decided they didn't really want them. Korean War kicks off, and they have to push forward their development of armour very quickly. They've had the M47, the M48, what they call pattern tanks. This is the M60 version, and in many ways that family of tanks, they just get bigger with thicker armour and larger guns on them. The M60, it's got that British 105mm gun fitted on it. They were going to have laminate armour placed on it, but in the end, the problems of producing that meant they went back to cast steel. So that huge, great turret you see on the top is just a huge casting, almost a mini turret on top of that, with a 50 caliber machine gun for the commander, and a steel hull with a whopping great diesel engine in the back. Now, the M60 was never a particularly showstopper of a tank, but it was good enough, just like the Sherman. And the Americans made an awful lot of them, I think about 4,500. They were sold around the world. They were passed on to fellow NATO countries, allies. They're still in service. Turkey, Greece, Egypt has a large number. The Americans have taken them all out of service now. They tend to be originally downgraded National Guard units. There's still fleets of them in the desert. Yet again, I do wonder how many of these are going to be what tanks are going to be revived because of what's going on out in the Ukraine at the moment, what older tanks might be being souped up again to be potentially used. But the M60, it never ends up seeing combat service in Vietnam. They used other models there. It does see service with the US Marines in the Gulf War, and that was its last time really in action. After the Gulf War, they retired them from service. Israelis had a lot of M60s, and like many tanks as well, this one looks in its bare armour form. The Israelis added reactive armour, those blocks of armour to explode when they're hit. Blazer, it was called by the Israelis, and that takes the pressure of an incoming round or a hollow charge round away from the vehicle. So there's a pretty impressive display of running armour there that's gone around this afternoon. What we're going to do now is we're going to start the Tiger up again.
So what we do is we take a cover off the back of the tank and fit this bracket, which we've already done to save time, and then screw the starting handle into the back of the tank. The starter is a little bit like years ago. You used to have little cars where you could pull them back and let them go, they go flying across the room. Well, this is the same sort of thing. It uses lots and lots of gears inside the starter to create this really unstoppable piece of kit. So we've got Gary and Steve, all ready to go. And so it's very, very slow to start with. So they start turning the starter, and it takes a fair bit of muscle. Normally we use people we don't like to do this, but today is different. And we get it up to speed, and when it's ready to go, it'll turn the engine over about 6 revolutions. Is the ignition on? Okay, try that. So we push a little rod into the back, gauges the starter, and it starts. That was amazing. So, for instance, if the tank has flat batteries, we can use this starter to start it.